It had been a day of waiting. Orbie discovered that even if you looked out the window 25 times, the truck from the hardware store doesn't come any faster. Katie found out that even if you draw 10 pictures, it doesn't mean the truck will be there when you finish. And they both learned that putting all your Sandbox toys on the floor in the living room still wasn't helping. Dad had just bought them a brand new Sandbox. It was bigger than the one they used to have and was made of a brightly colored plastic. It was going to be great. Orbie burgled that he was going to make the absolute biggest sandcastle in the whole wide world. And Katie told him she was going to dig a tunnel and make a lake with roads all around it. Orbie burbled to all his friends and told them that they were invited over to see the new Sandbox when it came. So when the truck from the hardware store finally drove down the street, you can only imagine how fast they shot out the front door. Katie and Orbie stood way back and peered into the truck to see their Sandbox. The man looked at a piece of paper and climbed right up on the truck. Then the man told them he'd found it. And he rolled the Sandbox to the edge of the truck. Dad moved over to help him, and they both lifted it down. It was big. Orbie couldn't help but imagine his huge sandcastle in it. And Katie imagined her tunnel and lake, and they looked at each other and jumped up and down. The truck driver and Dad hauled the Sandbox around to the back of the house with Katie and Orbie dancing and cartwheeling beside them. Yi Ping and Andy popped around into the backyard. They were carrying their sand toys. Both Katie and Orbie beamed as Yi Ping and Andy looked at the size of the new Sandbox. It was going to be great. Dad shook the man's hand and walked around to the front of the house with him. In 2 seconds, the four friends were lying inside the Sandbox and stretching to see if any of them could reach from one side to the other. But I have to tell you, it was so big, nobody could. Bryn and Phoebe were carrying their sand toys, too. And when they looked in the backyard, Orbie popped his head up and they raced over. Dad came around with a very heavy wheelbarrow. It had 2 big bags of sand piled in it. And after several trips back and forth to the Sandbox, dumping sand and getting more, the Sandbox was finally full. Katie and Orbie raced to get their toys in the living room while their friends jumped into the Sandbox. As Katie and Orbie raced out the back door, Orbie stopped. Dad was pouring a cold drink in the kitchen, and it looked like a really good idea. Orbie stopped for a quick glass of juice, then hurried on his way. Everybody was in the Sandbox, digging and laughing and having a good time. Dakota was there with his sand toys, too. Orbie burbled that he was coming and to make room. When Orbie got to the Sandbox and was ready to jump in, there was no room left. The Sandbox was big, but not big enough for all those friends and Orbie. Orbie looked at the Sandbox and suddenly felt sad. He'd waited all morning for it to be ready, and now that it was here, there was no room for him. Katie called that she'd saved him a place, and that was nice and all, but there sure wasn't enough room to build the biggest sandcastle in the whole wide world. Orbie dragged his sand toys over to Dad, who was now sitting on a lawn chair. He told Dad that he really didn't feel like playing in the Sandbox anymore. Dad reminded him that he had invited everybody, and Orbie nodded that he had. He looked at the Sandbox. Dad smiled and said there would be plenty of time to build the biggest sandcastle in the world, but right now, it looked like Orbie was having the biggest Sandbox party in the world. Orbie pricked up at this. When he looked over at his friends, it sort of did look like a Sandbox party. Dad said waiting was one of the hardest things to do. But while his friends were here, he might just have to wait and build his castle at a time when they were not around. I think Orbie agreed with Dad. But at that moment, Katie came over and asked Orbie if he was coming. She told him the Sandbox was fun, maybe a little crowded, but he should come and try it. Orbie looked at Katie and then back at Dad. Dad smiled, and Orbie smiled back, and he gave Dad a big smooch and grabbed Katie's hand. At the Sandbox, everybody was busy doing their own thing. But by this time, no one could really make anything. Bryn got annoyed at Dakota for sticking his elbow in her nose, and Yi Ping almost cried when Andy stepped on her mountain. The Sandbox was big, but maybe not big enough for all the friends to build different things in. Orbie looked at Katie and burbled that he had an excellent idea. The friends all stopped what they were doing and leaned in to listen. He told them of his great big castle idea and how he wondered if they all wanted to help. Together they could make a fantastic castle. No one said anything for a moment, and then they thought about it. And then there was a huge hoopla as they jumped into castle building. When they were all finished, Orbie was thrilled, and so were his friends. Katie was very proud of him because he had made a great plan that was good for everyone. And Dad was proud of him because he had taken something that wasn't going very well and turned it into something amazing. And do you know that to this very day, Orbie's Sandbox Party, where the biggest sand castle in the world was built, is one of the neighborhood's favorite days to remember? And if you had been there, I know you'd remember it too.
Did you know? When you go roller skating, it's very important to wear all your padding. You'll need a helmet, knee and elbow pads, and wrist guards. If you're not a very good skater, you might want padding in other places too.